I thought the rival mafia boss was my savior, but I was just a pawn. After my husband publicly humiliated me by parading his mistress at my 24th birthday party, I walked straight into the arms of his worst enemy. I spent 3 months in Dante's bed, wearing his shirts and believing I was safe. Then I found the hidden receipts in his office and the terrifying truth. He orchestrated my entire downfall. Open this case file together. You and I are going to unpack the psychological profile of a textbook megalomaniac narcissist and his captive. Picture the scene. It is the subject's 24th birthday. Her husband, Vittorio, enters the grand ballroom with his mistress proudly on his arm, a calculated display of absolute control. 300 guests await her emotional collapse, but instead of breaking, she exhibits a profound paradigm shift. Cured of her trauma bond, she removes her 4-generation wedding ring, hands it over, and relinquishes the shame. She walks out. Waiting, in the shadows, is Dante Valenti, the rival, the apex predator. This is where her true psychological awakening begins. Dante's smile in that moment signaled a transfer of power, opening a dangerous door to behavioral retribution. I am Dr. Lena, a criminal psychiatrist who has spent 15 years analyzing the minds of mob bosses and apex predators in maximum security facilities. Welcome to my case review, available exclusively on the My Stories network. We begin with Chapter 1. Observing the baseline of her environment on the morning of her birthday, Alessia awoke before her alarm. Her bedroom smelled of cold white lilies, mandated by her husband. He preferred flora that lacked the scent of a living, breathing woman. This is a classic indicator of a man who demands total erasure of his victim's identity. In a state of chronic hypervigilance, she reached across the freezing sheets, finding the bed empty. Vittorio maintained a separate sleeping quarters upstairs, a spatial manifestation of his emotional detachment. By the second year of her confinement, she had been conditioned to stop asking questions. Sitting up, she processed her age. 24, the number felt alien, entirely disconnected from her reality. At 20 years old, she had entered that estate with a university degree in art history and an identity of her own. Within a single week, her personal belongings were systematically confiscated and replaced by garments chosen by his staff, stripping away her autonomy piece by precise piece. The university diploma was entombed in a black frame on his office wall, displayed precisely like a hunter's taxidermy. She initially misinterpreted this gesture as affection. It was only later she realized it was an act of psychological containment. The glass frame symbolized her new boundaries. She was meant to remain trapped behind it forever. Walking barefoot to the cold window, she observed the bleak October morning descending over Milan. Her mind drifted southward to Florence. That was the city where, before her cognitive subjugation began, she possessed a vibrant life, waking up with dried paint under her fingernails and the scent of creative freedom lingering on her unblemished hands. With me here, because understanding her past is vital to understanding her psychological baseline. In her past life, she practiced the delicate art of restoring 15th century frescoes, an occupation demanding immense emotional regulation. A former mentor once noted that true restorers are recognized by the gentle reverence with which they handle a book before opening it. Alessia retained this singular physical habit. It was the last surviving fragment of her original psyche. Pressing her forehead against the freezing glass, she braced herself for her birthday. Vittorio had orchestrated a party, an event designed solely for his narcissistic supply. Conditioned to comply, she had selected a conservative black dress. To survive a megalomaniac, a victim often develops extraordinary observational skills as a primary defense mechanism. She outwardly agreed with his sartorial demands, while silently cataloging the vulnerabilities of his associates. She noted the severe diabetes of one lieutenant and the staggering financial debts of another. She constructed a complex mental database of these seemingly trivial details, a tactical advantage none of her captors realized she possessed. Wrapping herself in a sterile cream silk robe, she descended to the dining hall. The room was aggressively cavernous, featuring vaulted ceilings and a suffocatingly long table, meant to emphasize the vast emotional chasm between husband and wife. Observe the subject's husband in his natural habitat. Vittorio possessed a countenance layered with the heavy sediment of absolute power, chronic impatience and moral decay. In her naive youth, she had mistaken that dark psychological weariness for genuine depth. As she greeted him, he refused to break visual contact with his newspaper, a deliberate tactic to minimize her existence. The domestic staff mirrored this behavioral conditioning. The maid poured coffee with downcast eyes, knowing eye contact provoked the predator. When he finally acknowledged her birthday, he casually announced the party would be held at their Como estate, casually dictating that her attire had already been selected by him. She consumed the scalding coffee without physical reaction. Trauma victims often suppress somatic pain as a method of maintaining composure under threat. She carefully questioned the sudden relocation to Como, only to be met with his assertion that he had prepared a surprise. In the vocabulary of a psychological abuser, the word surprise is a weapon. It had previously signaled cancelled milestones, forced isolation, and blatant neglect. Even now, her nervous system betrayed her with a subtle physiological tremor she desperately tried to conceal. It is a vital life lesson. True safety is never found in the hands of someone who uses unpredictability as a tool to fracture your fundamental sense of security. For the first time that morning, Vittorio lowered his barrier and locked eyes with her. His gaze was entirely devoid of empathy, characteristic of an antisocial personality profile. He spoke to her with the slow, condescending cadence one might use to placate a dull child. He instructed her to simply smile and look pretty, demanding total psychological submission. Through deeply ingrained operant conditioning, her facial muscles obeyed automatically. It was her oldest survival reflex. Having re-established his dominance, he returned to his reading. She deliberately remained seated for 5 more minutes, a microscopic act of rebellion, before quietly leaving the oppressive atmosphere of the dining hall. Just before she escaped his proximity, he issued a final command, ordering her to wear the heavy family sapphire instead of the silver ring she currently wore. She exited without offering verbal confirmation. Once alone in the corridor, the physical toll of her repressed anxiety surfaced. She gripped the fabric of her robe, forcing her lungs to take 3 measured breaths. This was not explosive anger. It was the exhausting, hollow grief of being profoundly unseen. For 4 entirely suffocating years, this megalomaniac had never once realized that the simple silver band she wore on her finger belonged to her late mother. He lacked the basic emotional bandwidth to recognize her most sacred anchor to reality. You might be wondering the same thing I did. How does someone maintain their sanity in such extreme isolation? The answer lies in secret acts of rebellion. The garment Vittorio selected hung like a customized straitjacket in her closet. It was a modest, black silk piece designed to project ownership, rendering her a sophisticated accessory for his public theater. She adorned herself with the prescribed pearls and the massive sapphire engagement ring, an artifact that felt like a heavy iron shackle. Yet, inside a hidden pocket that Vittorio mistook for a tailor's whim, she concealed a potent talisman. It was a battered black fountain pen with a gold band, the sole surviving relic of her deceased father. It was the singular object in that fortress that remained entirely under her jurisdiction. She meticulously secured her hair and applied a dark cosmetic armor to her lips. Checking her reflection, she deployed that hollow, compliant smile, clinically verifying her disguise was fully functional. Descending the grand staircase, she found her captor concluding a phone call. When he finally turned, his visual assessment was chillingly detached. His eyes lingered for 3 seconds on the expensive jewelry resting against her collarbone, entirely ignoring the human being wearing it. Without a word of affection, he complained about her punctuality and ordered her to move toward the waiting, armored transport vehicle. The vehicle's heavy doors sealed shut with a distinct, metallic thud. To a clinical observer, it was the undeniable acoustic signature of a mobile vault locking its prisoner inside. As the car glided down the cypress-lined perimeter toward the Como estate, she stared blankly at the passing landscape. She operated under the tragic delusion that this evening would merely require her to absorb another routine humiliation. In cases of chronic psychological captivity, the brain normalizes severe emotional abuse, simply to guarantee biological survival. She believed enduring this pain was the necessary currency to reach her 25th year. She believed she could simply swallow the poison and carry on undisturbed. Cognitive dissonance was about to shatter permanently. We now enter Chapter 2 of our clinical analysis. The Como estate radiated artificial warmth, illuminated like an elaborate theatrical stage designed to mask the rot underneath. As they exited the vehicle, Vittorio gripped her elbow. It was a calculated application of physical force masquerading as marital chivalry, a microaggression meant to reinforce his supreme authority. Surrounding the perimeter were the high-ranking capos of the criminal syndicate, smoking in clustered formations like predatory sentinels. She effortlessly catalogued their sins: Salviati by the fountain, Lo Bianco near the steps. and Trentino escorting a woman who was certainly not his wife. You and I are going to unpack the architecture of pathological control. We begin with the subject Luca. Ascending the estate steps beside her is Vittorio, a textbook megalomaniac narcissist smile, he whispers. And her face obeys instantly, a reflex born of severe psychological manipulation. The environment is engineered for dominance. Venetian mirrors reflect dark tables, while scents of expensive tobacco saturate the air. A sluggish Vivaldi piece feels oppressive. Luca recognizes at least 50 faces, but her focus remains on 3 concealed cameras. Vittorio records his gatherings to clinically scrutinize social compliance later. They're all going to start arriving. He notes it is a closed ecosystem, where every guest is merely a controlled variable. Notice the verbal restraints applied here. He adjusts his cuff, "You states to me." Luca responds with total submission. I always do. When he searches her face, he finds a blank canvas. This emotional blunting is a classic survival mechanism. She projects nothing to avoid triggering his volatility. The surprise comes in. Half an hour, he announces, starting a psychological countdown in her mind. We observe her navigate the hall on autopilot. She greets Capo Salviati's wife, a corrupt dominzinger trading blessings for donations, and Ferry, the family lawyer, whose damp handshake leaves a residue of physical revulsion. Through every interaction, her painted smile never wavers, perfectly masking the profound trauma bond anchoring her to this artificial reality. Consumes exactly half a glass of champagne. Her behavior is rigidly calibrated: restrict intake, express excessive gratitude, and catalog every detail. This hypervigilance is a textbook symptom of her psychological captivity. Crossing the room to acknowledge Capo Lo Bianco's mother, a new stimulus enters her field of vision. A stranger stands isolated by the terrace doors. Let us assess his presentation. He is tall, dark-haired with premature white strands, wearing a precisely tailored black suit, devoid of typical Italian flamboyance. He wears no tie, his white shirt buttoned tight to the throat. One hand is pocketed, the other holds an untouched drink. He observes the room with the detached calculation of a rival predator, analyzing a complex criminal ecosystem. The stranger's gaze locks directly onto Luca. He does not avert his eyes. It is a subtle dominance display. Her reaction, looking away and keeping a steady pace, demonstrates her conditioned threat avoidance. Drifting back toward her husband, she casually interrogates the lawyer, the man near the terrace column, tall, no tie. Who is he? Ferry's rapid eye aversion betrays his own fear response. Dante Valenti, signora. Luca completely suppresses her physiological reaction. Valenti came here today? She asks. Ferry nervously explains: political invitation. Capo Salviati arranged it, a courtesy between families. To refuse would be indelicate. Indelicate, she repeats. Don Vittorio accepted last week. Luca thanks Ferry, silently resuming her obedient posture. You and I have seen this in criminal profiles, before the subject senses his observation, without visual confirmation. Luca feels Valenti's gaze from across the hall. It is not the deferential glance of a subordinate, it is a clinical dissection. After 4 years of enduring a severe trauma bond, she has catalogued every type of male gaze. This one is foreign, silently measuring her psychological weight. 15 minutes later, the environment shifts. Vittorio strikes his glass twice with a silver knife. Like subs conditioned to a master's signal, the guests instantly silence their conversations. Luca mirrors their obedience. Vittorio projects his voice with grandiose theatricality, demanding absolute attention. Friends, he announces, today my wife turns 24. Applause fills the room. Luca produces her mandated smile, masking her internal state. A megalomaniac narcissist, however, requires constant escalation, but today is also a night of introductions. Vittorio pivots. Turning the tribute into a public devaluation phase, he gestures to the door. There is someone many of you know from business, and whom I want tonight to introduce in a different way. Camille, his mistress, enters. Luca processes the data. Camille's appearance is meticulously weaponized: honey blonde hair pinned high, a provocative blood-red dress, and an aggressively curated smile. She is barely 23 yet. The most devastating psychological variable in this display is the unmistakable jewelry, resting heavily against her exposed collarbone. Stick with me, this is where the analysis gets disturbing. Luca's brain registers the threat before translating it. The necklace is a dark sapphire ringed in diamonds, an exact replica of her wedding ring. The cruelty is calculated. Vittorio deliberately cloned Luca's identity to drape it over her replacement. Her response is total autonomic suppression. She refuses to blink. Vittorio exhibits a smile of pure sadistic satisfaction, extracting massive narcissistic fuel from this orchestrated humiliation. Camille executes a flawlessly rehearsed approach across the room. Vittorio aggressively claims her waist, raises his glass to the elite, and delivers a surgically precise verbal strike. This is Camille, the woman who knows how to stand by my side without embarrassing me. The brief silence is the sound of an entire hierarchy processing public psychological execution. Subordination overrides morality. The capos mirror their dawn, raising glasses in complicit submission. Astonishingly, Luca mirrors them, holding her painted smile. From a clinical perspective, she is experiencing profound dissociation. The anticipated emotional collapse never materializes. Her nervous system initiates an extreme survival override. The environment becomes terrifyingly sharp, icy, and devoid of sound. In this absolute vacuum, her brain isolates, a single grounding anchor across the room. It is Valenti. He watches her with detached curiosity, studying her reaction exactly the way an analyst studies a trapped subject breaking under pressure. Vittorio finalizes the discard phase by kissing his mistress on the cheek, not his wife. The duplicate sapphire catches the light, a mocking symbol of Luca's erased value. Watch how she manages this public trauma. She lowers her glass with hyper-controlled precision. Refusing to display a tremor, she briefly presses her pocket to feel her father's pen. In behavioral psychology, this is a grounding object, a tactile anchor to a reality outside the abuser's control. Verifying her identity remains intact, she initiates movement. The room assumes her flight response has triggered, expecting a desperate rush for the exit. Her own brain briefly suggests this escape route, but she consciously overrides it. Escaping through that door leaves her psychological captivity unbroken. I will look at this together and pinpoint the exact moment of cognitive liberation. Fleeing would mean carrying her captor's name like a brand. It would leave the duplicate sapphire as an unearned prize here. The subject rejects the victim role entirely. She recalibrates her trajectory directly toward Camille, crossing the floor under the scrutiny of 300 eyes. With a perfectly regulated cadence, her motor control is flawless. The environmental paralysis deepens as the capos lower their glasses in collective anxiety. Vittorio observes her approach, but his pathological narcissism completely blinds him to reality. He produces a smug smile, utterly convinced that his broken wife is walking over to publicly embrace his new mistress. Vittorio anticipates the absolute perfection of his twisted design, but Luca halts exactly 1 meter away. Violating his script, she analyzes the mistress with detached precision. Up close, Camille's green eyes reveal profound vulnerability. A micro-expression, a tremor, at her forced smile betrays her terror. Luca recognizes this fear response instantly, having spent 4 years studying her own traumatized reflection. Drawing upon her grounding object, Luca accesses a chilling state of calm. Camille, she says, verbally disarming the younger woman, welcome. Camille is cognitively stunned. Executing a masterful reclamation of her autonomy, Luca raises her left hand with deliberate slowness. She begins to remove the ultimate symbol of her Stockholm syndrome. The action of metal sliding off skin creates an auditory illusion of deafening volume. It is the sound of a psychological cage snapping open. Luca extends her arm, presenting the sapphire. The mistress hesitates, darting her gaze to the alpha for permission, but observe the megalomaniac narcissist now. Vittorio is paralyzed, his glass arrested in midair. His eyes are wide with catastrophic realization. This is a classic narcissistic collapse. Luca's voice remains clinically empathetic. Hold out your hand, Camille, she says softly. Don't be afraid. It won't weigh more than it's already weighing. The terrified girl complies. Luca deposits the ring into her palm and deliberately closes the girl's fingers around the inescapable weight of her own impending trauma bond. Probably learned this life lesson: the ultimate victory over a manipulator isn't fighting them, it is handing them their poison and walking away. Luca maintains contact for 2 precise seconds, searing this image into the syndicate's memory. She projects her voice with devastating clarity, then keep it all. The man, the name, the shame, he's all yours. She severs contact. Crucially, she does not look at Vittorio. Depriving a narcissist of a reaction is the deepest wound possible. Turning to the room, she says, "Good evening. Thank you for the congratulations." She walks toward the door. Powerful capos, who previously raised glasses, now bow their heads in silent reverence to her display of psychological dominance. She walks out of captivity unbroken. Objects in the hall exhibited classic bystander paralysis. No one reacted. You and I are going to unpack this psychological break together. Behind her, Vittorio called her name Alessia. It lacked force. A megalomaniac narcissist cannot fathom being discarded. His brain simply misfires. She did not turn around. Pushing open the wooden doors, she met the October air. Cold, smelling of wet stone, she descended the staircase. Flight 1, steady. Flight 2, steady. By the third, the adrenaline crash hit. This is the physiological toll of severing a trauma bond. She stopped, gripped the iron rail, and forced her respiratory rate to normalize. 1 breath, 2, 3. She was finally reclaiming her autonomic nervous system. When she lifted her head, she found a new variable at the bottom of the staircase. Dante Valenti. He leaned against a sleek black car, devoid of crests, his posture hands in his coat, white shirt buttoned to the neck. Dark eyes steady, screamed apex predator in resting state. He had anticipated her exit, calculating the exact trajectory of her flight. Standing where the Belandi identity had just fractured, he spoke. Signora Belandi, he tested. Moretti, she corrected instinctively. This was a crucial psychological pivot. Returning the abuser's name is the first step in dismantling Stockholm Syndrome. He tilted his head half a centimeter. It was not a bow of submission. It was clinical curiosity. He was evaluating a survivor. Moretti, he repeated, elongating the final vowel. His vocal register was remarkably low, a stabilizing frequency meant to project authority without aggression. Who is taking you back to Milan? It was framed as a polite inquiry. Yet he had already deduced her isolation. I can offer you a ride. The delivery was mathematically precise, devoid of pressure. From her elevated step, she analyzed him, while he absorbed her panic with absolute calm, for 2 seconds. Her mind mapped the geometry of escape, the staircase, the parking lot, the gravel. She scanned for any other vehicle that could transport her away, desperate to avoid trading one cage for another. The human brain craves safety when traumatized, and his car felt dangerous. No other vehicle. Predators do not rely on coincidence. Her newly emancipated psyche, born mere minutes ago in that suffocating hall, made a rapid risk assessment. Boarding a rival syndicate leader's car registered as a lesser threat than awaiting the punitive retaliation of a humiliated narcissist. She descended the final steps, stopping exactly 1 meter from him. Close enough to detect the sensory data of his presence: heavy wool, a dry, unsweetened cologne. She met his gaze. These were not the volatile, reactive gray eyes of Vittorio. Dante's eyes were pitch black and deeply analytical. They measured her threshold for stress. Don Valenti, she stated, her vocal cords holding far more stability than her trauma allowed. Why was the Don waiting for me down here? She challenged. He maintained eye contact, a dominance display, masked as respect. Because I saw you cross the hall, he answered with deliberate pacing, and I understood where you would end up. His radical honesty disarmed her defense mechanisms for a fraction of a second. He had engineered that exact response. Don Valenti, she said, accessing a version of herself she had buried long before the abuse began, the scholarly girl who analyzed the world. If I am going to be used again tonight, I would rather know by whom. He suppressed a laugh. It was a microscopic micro-expression, a brief flash of genuine amusement that antisocial personalities only permit in the strictest privacy. Signora Mordi, he replied, his free hand pulling open the heavy rear door. For tonight, what I can promise is that no one is going to use me to get to you. That does not answer my question, she countered. It does not, he conceded. She examined the interior. Dark leather, no chauffeur. The ignition key was already engaged, the dashboard dead. This was the vehicle of an operator who eliminated variables when conducting sensitive psychological warfare. Behind her, the villa doors violently breached. Vittorio's voice echoed from the second flight of stairs, shouting her name with raw, unhinged volume. The auditory stimulus was jarring. This was no longer a man in denial of his fractured ego. He was breaking down completely. This was the auditory response of a megalomaniac who finally comprehended that his possession was gone. She entered the cabin. Dante secured the door with the deliberate caution of sealing a secure containment unit. He took the wheel, turned the key, and the engine engaged with a low, controlled hum. The vehicle rolled across the gravel without a spike in acceleration. Through the side mirror, she observed Vittorio reaching the bottom step, his immaculate facade crumbling. His hand hung in the air, grasping at a phantom. Her discarded ring remained upstairs, trapped in the fist of the woman who had helped sever her trauma bond. The car cleared the perimeter gate. Dante maintained absolute vocal silence through the first curves. He navigated the lakeside road with the automated precision of a man whose spatial awareness was highly developed. She observed his profile, the rigid jawline, the fixed gaze, a thin, surgical scar tracing from his left temple to his ear, a physical trauma marker he selectively concealed, revealed to her only because he allowed it. Don Valenti, she tested softly. Don Valenti, she aggressively corrected herself. Refusing to adopt his given name on the very night she had violently shed her husband's label. This is a classic boundary-setting mechanism. Where are we going? She demanded. He did not break visual focus on the road. To a place where no one will enter, without your permission, until you decide your next step. And if I decide to go back to Milan, she tested. I will take you, he replied. Tonight. She directed her vision forward. The terrain undulated alongside Lake Como, its black surface, acting as a sensory deprivation void. She pressed her hand against her dress, feeling the solid shape of her father's pen, a grounding object. For the first time, she processed her father's memory through the lens of her current survival state. She hypothesized that he would validate her escape. Yet, a chilling cognitive dissonance set in. He might have understood the pathology of the silent driver beside her far better than she did. Dante was calculating variables and running psychological algorithms she was entirely blind to. Shifted the transmission, dropping the engine's acoustic pitch. Signora Moretti, he stated, his visual focus locked forward. Tonight you ended something. I need you to know that. I know that. And have you started something, Don Valenti? The counter-interrogation slipped out before her prefrontal cortex could suppress it. Let us examine this interaction closely. She was testing his motives, a healthy sign of trauma recovery. He shifted his eyes toward her for a fraction of a second. Then back, perhaps, he answered. Perhaps is not an answer, she challenged. It is the only one I can give right now. She absorbed this, closing her eyes against the cold glass. Back at the villa, the remnants of her abusers were losing control. The narcissistic collapse of Vittorio would currently be on full display. The syndicate elites would be exchanging nonverbal cues, clinically assessing which sociopath had absorbed the greater deficit. They would be recalculating their loyalties. The minutiae of their politics evaded her, but the behavioral baseline was clear. She had entered Dante's vehicle of her own volition. No coercion, no manipulation. For the first time in 4 years of deep systemic subjugation, she had executed a conscious, independent variable shift. The engine surged. The vehicle carved through the darkness, and in the distance, an isolated light illuminated a hidden structure before vanishing into the landscape. Her autonomy was finally returning. He remained unaware that the isolated light belonged to his personal compound. The vehicle descended, a narrow, serpentine road toward the black expanse of the water, reflecting sporadic points of illumination. The tactile feedback of the cold leather beneath her palms served to ground her racing nervous system. Dante operated the machine in absolute silence, one hand executing precise steering corrections, the other resting on the shift lever. She covertly studied his cranial structure in the dim dashboard glow. They had bypassed a dormant settlement minutes prior. The digital interface registered 0100 hours. We are almost there, he announced, his tone devoid of any escalating tension or predatory anticipation. Where for what exactly? She challenged. For you to decide whether you want to sleep, or whether you would rather start with the bad part. This was a classic framing technique, offering an illusion of control to a subject starved for agency. She processed the dark humor internally, maintaining a rigid exterior affect. Start with the bad part. I will sleep later. His facial muscles contracted minimally, a genuine smile originating at the ocular orbital. They breached a massive iron gate. A gravel drive ascended toward a pale stone facade. Here is the lesson we must draw from her file. True freedom begins the exact moment you realize the cage was always unlocked and you simply had to choose the terror of stepping outside. To me, because you and I are going to unpack the architecture of survival. Dante's men had waited for hours. Villa Valenti, he announced. You will not be locked in, you will be protected. Make the distinction in your head. I already had as an analyst. I know cognitive reframing is the brain's first shield against panic. A gaunt man named Tommaso opened my door with the ironic smile of a man used to blind obedience. Signora Moretti is going to stay, Dante ordered. Tommaso's handshake was firm. A classic dominance test. The house will get used to a female voice, he noted clinically, breathing in the scent of cold tobacco on those stone steps. I realized a simple truth. The spaces we fear will break us are often the very ones that forge our ultimate resilience. The chandelier cast fractured shadows across the foyer. Right, a marble staircase left, a corridor bleeding yellow light. I mapped the spatial geometry in 3 seconds. Flat, a hypervigilant response as I've studied in countless inmates. My father's pen weighed in my pocket like a grounding anchor. Dant led me to a sitting room and shed his jacket. I spotted a faint smudge of my makeup on his shoulder from a previous touch. I logged the detail but stayed silent in power dynamics. Hoarding observations builds leverage. Sit, he commanded softly. I prefer to listen standing, I countered. He rested his hand on an armchair and didn't push it. Remember this life lesson: never surrender your physical elevation in a room where someone is actively trying to establish baseline control. The proposal is simple, he began, his tone dropping to that hypnotic frequency predators use to simulate intimacy. He wanted me to stay, and in return I would testify against Vittorio, not in a court, but at the syndicate's private dinners. I was to weaponize Vittorio's megalomaniac narcissism, repeating what the kingpin had arrogantly said, assuming I was too insignificant to comprehend. You're offering protection for information. I clarified, I am. And you think that puts me at a disadvantage. Dante didn't flinch. I'm telling you what I have to offer. We locked eyes for a long clinical minute. He never blinked, a vital lesson for anyone facing intimidation. Silence acts as a mirror if you refuse to fill the quiet. Your opponent is forced to sit with their own discomfort. I crossed my arms, the cold satin dress, a sensory reminder of the danger I was navigating. Then I also have conditions, I stated. I demanded a room with my own key, no armed men inside, and total access to Vittorio's historical syndicate files. I needed raw data before I spoke. He tilted his head, a micro-expression of frustration flashing as his jaw locked. Documents from 5 years ago. Don't leave my office. He pushed back. Then L read in your office. I countered instantly. He accused me of wanting to sit in his chair, but my demand was purely survival-driven. I refused to be a blind pawn. The lesson is critical boundaries aren't polite. Requests you make of dangerous men. They are rigid perimeters you enforce with unwavering conviction. If that's too much, I go back to the car and you handle Vittorio without a witness, I stated. The silence stretched for 3 seconds. By the door, Tommaso feigned interest in his watch. A textbook displacement behavior. I accept, Dante conceded. I felt an involuntary drop in cortisol as my shoulders relaxed, pausing at the threshold. Dante asked if I knew how much he despised negotiating with someone who knew exactly what they wanted. Yes, I replied. It's the only reason I accepted the ride later. He showed me a room overlooking the lake, handing me a heavy bronze key while ensuring his fingers never grazed my skin. Remember, this true autonomy is never freely given by those in power. It must be negotiated with the absolute willingness to walk away. I manipulated the lock so I'd hear the mechanical click from within. He needed me to know the key worked exclusively for me, a rare concession of control. I spent 30 minutes staring at the ceiling, letting the adrenaline metabolize. Before placing my father's pen on the nightstand, I slept with moonlight slicing through the curtains. Within 3 days, I mentally mapped the compound without asking questions: East Wing library, West Wing office, a decaying chapel. On the second day, the consigliere Renzo loomed in my doorway. 6 feet of suppressed hostility, Signora. I hope the Don knows what he is doing, he muttered. Take this life lesson to heart. Observation is your greatest quiet weapon in a hostile ecosystem. Map every exit and threat before you speak a word. I replied, keeping my tone devoid of emotional leakage. On the 3rd day, a wrong turn led me to the library. It was a cavernous space with dark oak shelves and boxes spilling literature onto the floor, a chaotic hoard untouched for years. Driven by a clinician's need to impose order on chaos, I shut the door and started sorting. By Wednesday night, I had mentally catalogued a massive section of the room. That's when I found it, hidden on the west wall. Tucked behind a heavy wooden ladder and concealed by a thick volume of Dante lay a secret. Here is something you and I both know about human psychology. The things we bury deepest in the dark are exactly what dictate our daily actions. Imposing order is just how we cope with unpredictable monsters. Finding the book behind Dante's namesake drew a clinical half-smile from me. It was a children's tale, bound in faded blue inside, a mother's script read for my Dante, so he learns not to be afraid of the dark. Mama, 1992. I closed the cover, feeling a sober tightness in my chest. It wasn't. Pity is useless in my field. It was the realization of his core wound. Vittorio used to mock the Valenti family's grief during his narcissistic monologues at dinner. Dante, hiding this book here, was a textbook manifestation of unresolved trauma. It's a painful life lesson. We all must eventually face the grief we refuse to process. It doesn't just disappear. It builds a permanent fortress around our minds, turning us into silent prisoners of our own emotional defenses. I weighed the behavioral outcomes of my next move. Feign ignorance, provoke a response, keep it as psychological leverage. I chose passive observation. I sat on the ladder, reading the first page as daylight bled away. I never heard the door open, only the sudden thud of his footsteps. I looked up to see Dant framed in the threshold, his collar open in a rare display of physical ease. He froze, his eyes locked onto the faded blue book in my hands for a torturous second, flicked to my face then back. I watched his jaw clench as his psychological walls slammed shut, restoring his cold baseline. The lesson is profound. True vulnerability isn't loud. It exists purely in that microscopic fraction of a second before our emotional armor is violently forced back into place. Dant didn't utter a word. He took a hesitant half-step inside, his fight-or-flight response short-circuiting, before retreating. He pulled the door shut with reverent gentleness, like closing a sleeping child's door. I stayed still, replacing the book. My brain filed the pathology: deceased mother, repressed attachment, vulnerability exposed for 2 seconds. It was premium data, the exact psychological leverage I could use to shatter his composure. I wasn't sure yet what version of myself I needed to be to survive him later. Tommaso hovered in the kitchen while I sliced day-old bread, exhausted by the cook's bland meals. The life lesson is crucial. Every piece of human behavior is raw data. And knowing exactly when to withhold that data is the ultimate form of power. Tommaso delivered the intelligence like a clinician sharing lab results. Camille attended Vittorio's dinner wearing the infamous family ring, jammed onto her pinky. It was a desperate bid for validation. Intoxicated, she loudly mocked me to the capos, claiming I was too weak to wield our name. I didn't ask for gossips, I stated, eyes fixed on my knife. You didn't ask, Tommaso countered. I brought an important difference. I kept slicing the bread in methodical silence, and Vittorio, I probed first. The megalomaniac laughed, fueling her grandiosity. By the second hour, he commanded her to shut her mouth in front of a rival boss. Remember this life, lesson-deep insecurity always shouts for attention. But genuine authority only needs a single whisper to completely cut you down. By the third hour, Vittorio escorted her outside by the elbow. Tommaso revealed. Lo Bianco saw it, signora. A rival capo watching the Don handle his mistress like a servant. That's a critical shift in the ecosystem. I placed the knife down. Keep bringing the gossip, Tommaso, please. He gave a grim nod and vanished, left alone. I mentally dissected the pathology of the event. Vittorio, a textbook megalomaniac narcissist, was projecting his internal humiliation onto Camille, using her as a lightning rod for his bruised ego, while Lo Bianco calculated the decay of his empire. I felt no pity for Camille's Stockholm syndrome. Not yet. The lesson is undeniable. When toxic individuals lose control of their environment, they always destroy the people standing closest to them first. Stick with me, because this is where the psychological puzzle locks together. I realized with clinical clarity that Camille was a disposable object to a man who discarded humans by habit. That vulnerability would serve as my leverage later. By Wednesday, my insomnia flared at 3 a.m. I descended to the library. Spread out 3 maritime maps I'd excavated from the desk: Genoa, Trieste, La Spezia. I traced smuggling routes Vittorio had bragged about for 4 years, behind doors he falsely assumed were soundproof. I was marking a cross near Savona when the heavy door groaned open. Dant stood there, barefoot in dark sleepwear. The simplest life lesson I can offer is this: knowledge is utterly useless until you are brave enough to map out your own escape. So please, Casile, and examine the initial interaction. The subject, Dant, presents with subtle signs of calculated dishevelment. His hair is tousled, carrying a bottle of unlabeled red wine and 2 glasses in a single hand, an overt display of relaxed dominance. He tells Alessia he could not sleep. Note the time: 3 a.m. This is the witching hour for the hypervigilant mind. Alessia, conditioned by her megalomaniac, narcissistic husband, Vittorio, leaves her maps exposed. She does not hide her work. When Dante enters and carefully places the glasses down, her autonomic nervous system betrays her. Her heart rate elevates. This is the physiological onset of what we often identify as Stockholm syndrome, fear mutating into anticipation. Observe the spatial dynamics at play here at 3 a.m. Dante selects a high-backed chair, positioning himself directly across the central table, a classic interrogation posture, softened by the pouring of wine. He does not ask for her consent to pour. He simply pushes the dark, dense liquid across the varnished wood. This is a subtle boundary test. He observes her cartography skills, noting she marks ports like an artist. Alicia replies that she was supposed to be a restorer. In criminal behavioral analysis, we see this often: the victim mourning their stolen potential. She brings the black cherry wine to her lips. She waits. She does not volunteer information. A survival mechanism learned from years of severe psychological suppression. Silence is a potent tool in behavioral interrogation, and Dante uses it flawlessly, waiting for her to break. When Alessia finally speaks, she points to Genoa, detailing the illicit shipping routes her former captor, Vittorio, disguised as olive oil. She maps out the phantom cooperatives and names the syndicate operatives like Capo Trentino. Dante merely rests his elbows on the table, absorbing the intelligence. She reveals that another capo, Ferry, is effectively under Dante's control through a complex web of debt. When Dante questions her source, her answer is profoundly telling. Vittorio spoke loudly when intoxicated, and she intentionally left doors ajar. The lesson here is simple. Never underestimate the quiet observer in a room. Let us analyze this profound psychological pivot. Dante asks if Vittorio ever suspected her espionage. Alessia states she was deemed merely decorative for 4 years. In the mind of a megalomaniac narcissist like Vittorio, a spouse is a possession, incapable of independent cognition, but trauma breeds hypervigilance, and she listened. Then, Dante shifts the physical boundary. He asks to see La Spezia. Walking around the table to invade her personal space, he leans over the map. His arm brushes hers, the cotton of his shirt against her robe. Neither of them recoils. In a clinical setting, well, this is the exact moment we observe the trauma bond cementing. The warmth she feels is a dangerous neurological cocktail of adrenaline and oxytocin. Alessia leverages her acquired intelligence, revealing the movement of physical currency in suitcases to Tunisia, laundered through 2 banks in Lugano. She looks at Dante's face, her brain recording minute details like the thin scar near his temple, a classic symptom of heightened sensory awareness in survival situations. She states she does not give passwords away for free. Dante's response is a muted exhalation, an internal laugh acknowledging her transactional defiance. He retreats to his chair, re-establishing distance. The negotiation of power is stabilizing. They discuss syndicate operations until 4:30 in the morning. For the clinician, this is textbook behavior. The captive is negotiating her own value to avoid being discarded. First time in 4 years, an authority figure validates Alessia's intellect regarding merchandise trafficking. She rationalizes this interaction as pure strategy. Her clinical detachment is fascinating. She believes he is using her, and she is allowing it because it guarantees her survival. This was their unspoken contract, yet her analytical mind misses a crucial somatic cue. When Dante refilled her glass, his hand exhibited a micro-tremor, spilling the wine. A minor neurological misfire indicating repressed emotional volatility. Days later, a heavy October rain batters the estate. The rhythmic drumming of the storm serves as a white noise backdrop to her continued isolation in the library, a self-imposed psychological quarantine. The environment shifts abruptly. Alessia detects smoke and investigates, finding Dante in the kitchen. The apex predator of this criminal syndicate is standing before a stove, a dishcloth on his shoulder, stirring a violently smoking pan. The counter is chaotic shattered eggshells, melted butter, an open wine bottle. It is a scene of complete domestic failure, a stark contrast to his usual hyper-controlled persona. He anticipates her critique, stating the professional cook's meal is ready. But this ruined risotto was an independent pursuit. The facade of the untouchable boss fractures here. It is essential to recognize that even the most calculated individuals possess a desperate need to engage in normal, grounding human rituals, no matter how poorly they execute them. I must look closely at her reaction, as it is a critical diagnostic marker. Alicia observes the ruined meal in the smoking pan, and her trauma response violently short-skits. She begins to laugh. It starts as a low tremor and escalates into uncontrolled, undignified hysteria. She has to physically support herself against the doorframe. This is not genuine amusement. It is a profound nervous system discharge. A psychological purge after 6 years of suffocating hypervigilance under her narcissistic ex-husband. Her brain's cold, calculating center, the survival mechanism that never sleeps, temporarily shuts down. Dante turns off the heat and studies her with an indecipherable expression, witnessing the raw collapse of her defensive architecture. He acknowledges the failure, admitting he burned the pan, and then he presents a rare behavioral anomaly. He smiles. It is not the calculated smirk of a manipulator, but a genuine, unmasked expression. It is the first authentic emotional display she has witnessed from him in 3 weeks. Alessia's laughter abruptly ceases. Her defense mechanisms snap back into place like a triggered trap. He offers a clumsy apology, suggesting they eat bread and butter instead. At this precise moment of vulnerability, the underboss, Tommaso, intrudes. Tommaso observes the smoke, the lingering trace of amusement on Alessia's face. and dryly notes that the boss has ruined dinner again. The tension immediately reverts from intimate psychological exposure to syndicate hierarchy. Delicate domestic illusion shatters the moment. 3 sets of headlights pierce the rain outside, unannounced visitors, in the criminal underworld. An unexpected arrival is a biological threat trigger. Dante's facial musculature hardens instantly, his sympathetic nervous system preparing for conflict. He informs her that his captains have arrived for an unscheduled summit. He commands her to retreat to the safety of the library, but Alessia makes a fascinating countermove. She declares she will go to the sitting room. She insists that if she is to be a pawn in this cartel's game, the other pieces must acknowledge her presence on the board. This is a profound reclamation of agency. She is actively rejecting the passive victim role her past abuser forced upon her. Alessia prepares herself for this social combat with clinical precision. She sheds her soft cardigan for a severe, black high-necked blouse, deliberately utilizing her physical presentation as armor. When she enters the formal dining room, the syndicate captains Renzo, Bianchi, and Conti are already assembled. Dante does not speak when he sees her. Instead, he executes a masterful display of territorial ownership and protection. He crosses the room, removes his own jacket, and drapes it over her shoulders. He avoids skin contact, yet the weight of the fabric, infused with his scent and the kitchen smoke, acts as a sensory anchor. In the primal language of these criminal organizations, he is visibly marking her as an extension of his own absolute authority. He takes her arm and presents her to his subordinates. He introduces her as Signora Moretti, pointedly stripping away her former husband's surname, Belandi. This is a severe psychological severance from her past trauma, when Renzo, a traditionalist capo, verbally questions the presence of a woman at a syndicate table. The tension spikes. The other men silently align with the objection. Dante's response is a textbook exhibition of autocratic dominance. He does not yell. He simply states that she will sit, and anyone who refuses to accept it may leave before the wine is served. The underlying threat is absolute. No one moves. He then pulls out the chair to his immediate right, physically elevating her status in the hierarchy before securing his own position. Let us conclude this session by analyzing her internal state during the summit. Alessia rationalizes the jacket as mere political theater, a calculated move to prove she is protected by the Valenti family. Yet, she admits a microscopic fracture in her emotional armor when he used her maiden name, restoring a fragment of her lost identity. She maintains a neutral affect, pouring her own water to project self-sufficiency. Tommaso whispers a vital piece of collateral data. Dante has never shared wine with anyone like this before. Alessia registers this anomaly but remains silent. She speaks very little, she observes in the end. The most profound lesson is that trauma survivors are often the most dangerous people in the room, simply because they have learned how to listen. Today, you and I are going to unpack a fascinating case study in criminal survival. We observe Alessia in a room of apex predators. Renzo outlines the northern territories, detailing which crime bosses are active and which the megalomaniacal narcissist Vittorio falsely believes he controls. Dante interrogates the room with clinical detachment, never glancing at her. Then comes the opening she needs. She speaks up, dissecting Capo Salviati. Vittorio thinks Salviati is a loyal subject, she notes. But a narcissist always misreads loyalty. Salviati only loves the harbor access Vittorio promised and failed to deliver in January. Alessia understands a simple life lesson. Here promises made to dangerous men are debts written in blood. She plays them flawlessly. She proposes a calculated psychological strike, offers Salviati his harbor, and he flips overnight. The room falls dead silent. Dante asks about Lo Bianco, still refusing eye contact. Alessia then profiles Lo Bianco with terrifying precision. She explains that Lo Bianco watched Vittorio physically manhandle a mistress. The physical force meant nothing, but the sociopathic indifference triggered Lo Bianco, who recently lost a brother. Unprocessed grief often masquerades as sudden rage. Renzo, stunned by her insight, asks where she learned to analyze pathology. So well, she tells them the truth. 4 years of quiet observation at dinner tables, absorbing the flaws of men who thought she was just decoration. Never underestimate a silent observer in a room full of egos. It absorbs her behavioral analysis without a single word, dismissing the meeting exactly 10 minutes later. As the underbosses scatter into the rain, he turns his gaze to her. She still wears his jacket, a physical anchor hinting at classic trauma bonding. In high-stress confinement, victims often develop a dependence similar to Stockholm Syndrome, seeking safety from their captors. For the first time, His expression drops the sociopathic mask, revealing genuine relief. He notes that she systematically dismantled 2 of Vittorio's alliances in a single week. When asked why she revealed this intelligence, her answer establishes dominance. She refuses to be a pawn anymore. She demands to be a player. He offers no gratitude. In their brutal world, gratitude is merely a vulnerability. Any display of thanks would have completely shattered the fragile power dynamic they just established. She leaves the room, deliberately keeping his jacket until the following morning. Saturday arrives heavy and bleak, the relentless overnight rain turning the lake into a sheet of liquid iron. When Alessia enters the kitchen, she finds Tommaso gripping the telephone. His facial microexpressions signal an absolute behavioral shutdown. He hangs up immediately, stating that the boss is on his way down. He refuses to break the bad news himself, deferring to authority, a classic self-preservation tactic in organized crime structures. We can see a vital lesson here. When the people paid to protect you stop speaking, the danger has already crossed your threshold. Tommaso finally exhales. Unable to contain the psychological weight of the crisis, he explains that an informant tipped them off before dawn. Vittorio, operating with the classic paranoia of a megalomaniac, began suspecting one of his own men. To reassert control, Vittorio had the man's wife murdered. A handwritten note was pinned to her body, displaying the exact address of their current safe house, with Alessia's name signed at the bottom. This is a textbook terror tactic. Vittorio is simultaneously traumatizing his subordinate and terrorizing Alessia. The chilling reality sets in. Vittorio is not just tracking her location, he is actively demonstrating his omnipotence. Power isn't just about what predator can do, it is about making the prey anticipate the strike. Let's look at this piece by piece, shall we? Vittorio was not merely issuing a threat. He was laying the psychological groundwork for extreme violence. By Sunday morning, the atmosphere inside the villa undergoes a severe environmental shift. Alessia wakes up not to the light, but to an unnatural, suffocating quiet. Through basic operant conditioning, she has memorized the baseline acoustics of the house, the creak of the kitchen door, the rhythmic steps of the guards, the delivery of morning bread. Today, every single baseline variable is missing. This deviation is a massive red flag. When an established routine violently stops, it means the entire system has shifted into a defensive survival posture. The unseen threat is already tearing their reality apart. She steps onto the freezing kitchen tiles and finds Tommaso completely stripped of his usual coping mechanisms. No coffee, no fresh bread, not even his standard layer of sarcastic detachment. He slowly lowers his phone, his body language caught between duty and genuine pity. He relays Dante's command she is to remain confined to her quarters. Alessia instantly challenges this containment protocol. She asks when Dante ever had the authority to dictate her movements. Tommaso offers a hollow, joyless smile, admitting that Dante lacks that power, which is exactly why it was phrased as a request. She refuses to submit, deliberately walking over to start the stove. Refusing to sit during a crisis is a fundamental biological response. The human body demands motion when cornered. Tommaso studies her in clinical silence as she waits for the water to boil. Without turning, she demands the unvarnished truth. He confirms the intelligence. The wife of the suspected traitor is indeed dead, perfectly matching Dante's initial report. As the kettle screams, Alessia kills the heat. She notes her own alarmingly steady hands, frustrated by her trauma-induced numbness. The narcissist Vittorio slaughtered a completely innocent woman just to use her corpse as a stationary notepad. Alessia experiences a dark cognitive merge, realizing she and the dead woman are identical. In Vittorio's sick mind, both are mere objects to be utilized. The syndicate's foundation is rapidly collapsing. Key figures are locked down or going silent, waiting for the blood to settle. Tommaso hesitates, recognizing her behavioral shift. He asks if she plans to stay behind. She firmly replies that she is going with them. He stares at her, a moment too long, warning her that Dante will fiercely reject this boundary violation. She dismisses Dante's emotional response entirely. Right on cue, Dante materializes at the door, wearing a dark jacket and projecting a deeply unsettling, calm, defensive mechanism. Sociopaths use when internally destabilized. Renzo shadows him, visibly exhausted from a futile argument. Dante orders the car to the front. As Tommaso vanishes, Alessia repeats her demand to join them. Dante delivers a flat, absolute denial, but she counters, anchoring her logic on Vittorio using her name on a corpse. She refuses to be sidelined by terror. She tells him directly that she will not be left behind in agonizing suspense. Dante invades her personal space, stopping just inches away, and drops his voice into a dominant register. He explains that they are not dealing with a rational actor today. They are dealing with Vittorio's shattered ego, and a malignant narcissist with wounded pride always acts with catastrophic, unthinking violence. Alessia brilliantly turns his own logic against him. If they are facing an erratic predator, they need the one person who fully comprehends his psychological triggers. Renzo makes a stifled sound in the background, recognizing her tactical victory. Dante stares at her, his rigid control breaking. He concedes the match, ordering her to remain hidden in the back seat of the vehicle. Dante tries to enforce a strict behavioral contract. She must not speak unless spoken to. Alessia immediately rejects this submissive dynamic, reminding him that he does not dictate her choices. He exhales slowly through his nose, a subtle micro-expression that serves as his ultimate form of surrender. He formally asks her to remain in the back seat, and she finally agrees. She dresses for utility in survival dark clothing, sensible footwear. In a profound psychological gesture, she slips her father's pen into her pocket. It acts as a grounding object, a tangible tether to her identity in a world stripping it away. Never underestimate the power of a physical anchor in a crisis. Downstairs, the vehicle waits. Dante opens her door in complete heavy silence. The trap is set. Let's examine the geography of this trap together. The road to Bellagio is a fatal bottleneck, a narrow strip of pavement squeezed between a sheer mountain and deep water. Alessia's spatial awareness kicks into hyperdrive. She abandons all aesthetic appreciation and purely analyzes the tactical disadvantages. No shoulder, no lateral escape routes. She processes the terrain exactly as a psychopathic ambush specialist would, feeling a wave of self-disgust at how easily she mirrors Vittorio's dark cognition. Tommaso navigates the hazardous curves with terrifying efficiency. Dante sits rigidly, his body language coiled, analyzing the road like a complex equation. Suddenly, his hyper-vigilant spikes, he interrogates Tommaso about a distant gray vehicle spotted 5 curves ahead. Tommaso confirms the gray car has been tracking them since they departed the estate. Dante immediately checks their rear flank, identifying a solitary motorcycle 2 curves behind them. In the criminal underworld, motorcycles signify agile, disposable hitmen. Before their minds can fully process the threat, the kinetic reality of the ambush shatters the tension. The auditory processing lags behind the physical impact. A sharp, mechanical crack hits the glass, starring the window in a web of violence. Dante violently forces her down to the floorboards, pinning her beneath his own mass. She feels a sudden, unnatural tremor rack his frame, the physical shock of a high-velocity bullet. Bleeding. He whispers an impossibly calm order to escape. True panic is always utterly silent. Tommaso states the brutal geographic truth. There is absolutely nowhere to turn. Dante commands him to invent an exit. The heavy vehicle violently swerves, ripping metal against stone as the shooters reload their weapons. Dante remains anchored over her, his respiration severely elevated. Alessia registers a warm, spreading fluid soaking into her shoulder, identifying the biometric reality. It is arterial blood, and it is not hers. She informs him clinically that he has been shot. He confirms it with zero emotional inflection as she demands to assess the wound. Tommaso slams the brakes. The chaos culminates in shrieking rubber, a door violently opening, and distant gunfire. Then comes a catastrophic silence, the brain's self-defense mechanism shutting down audio input entirely. Let us open the file on this particular evening. Tommaso returned, reporting a stone structure about 80 meters away. They would proceed on foot. It was then that the subject, Dante, attempted to rise, revealing the precise puncture wound just beneath his right collarbone. He cradled his arm, shivering as if freezing, displaying the classic somatic shock response. She told him to get on his feet. He stubbornly claimed he was. It is a fascinating psychological defense mechanism, denial of vulnerability in a predator-heavy environment. He emitted a soundless laugh that carried more agony than a scream. Together, they extracted him from the vehicle. Tommaso took the vanguard. Weapon drawn, she supported Dante, who clinically masked his physical deterioration by barking orders to walk faster. You and I are going to unpack this behavioral shift together. They navigated loose stones and bypassed a decaying fig tree until the structure emerged. It was a derelict fisherman hut, a place of isolation. Tommaso breached the door with his shoulder. Securing the perimeter, he estimated 2 or 3 minutes of safety. Dante accepted this margin. She positioned him on a rigid wooden chair in the desolate kitchen and meticulously peeled away his garments. His white shirt was saturated with arterial fluid. In moments of extreme trauma, the human brain often detaches to survive. She found herself clinically calculating blood volume loss before total systemic failure. effectively shutting off her emotional response. She demanded Tommaso supply a medical kit, taking complete psychological control of the room. Tommaso retrieved a standard safe-house medical supply bag from beneath the sink. It contained surgical thread, a curved needle, and local anesthetic. Here we see a fascinating regression to her past. Before she became entangled with a megalomaniac narcissist, she had spent 2 years training in first aid in Florence. Her mother had instilled in her a simple, meaningful life lesson: a hand trained to restore art must also possess the strength to mend torn flesh. The projectile had exited the body, a rare stroke of anatomical mercy. She systematically cleansed her hands, sterilized the equipment over an open flame, and injected the anesthetic along the wound margins, falling back into the comforting rigidity of her clinical conditioning. He inhaled sharply, suppressing his vocal pain response. It is a textbook display of hypermasculine conditioning. She demanded his absolute focus, threatening to curse him if he lost consciousness. He insisted he would not fail. She initiated the dermal repair, warning him that the initial puncture is psychologically the most taxing, as it proves the flesh is yielding. Soon the procedure devolved into a steady, hypnotic rhythm. Her hands exhibited zero tremors, a physiological phenomenon that deeply unsettled her. She was operating not from a place of fear, but of profound anger. Let this be a lesson. Anger often provides a steady hand where panic would falter, anchoring the mind during chaos. Tommaso continually swept the perimeter until the fading light confirmed their pursuers had vanished. The olfactory environment was thick with stone dust, decaying maritime air, and abandoned sustenance. The encroaching shadows painted the room in an oppressive shade of lead. With every meticulous suture, Dante observed her with a detached intensity, anchoring his consciousness to her presence so he would not succumb to the void. When she finalized the closure, his eyelids fluttered shut. Clinically speaking, he was entirely awake. He severed visual contact to shield her from witnessing his profound physical vulnerability. It is a defense mechanism, born of deep-seated trust issues. Night swallowed the landscape with the sudden, violent finality typical of northern Italy in late autumn. Tommaso performed a final visual sweep of the patient and exited the perimeter without uttering a single word. Also prepared rudimentary sleeping arrangements in the adjacent sector. She remained stationed beside the patient, wiping the biological evidence from her own skin with a damp rag. Observing his feigned slumber, her psyche began to fracture. She reflected on entering his vehicle 2 weeks prior, a calculated gamble to identify her true manipulator. Here is the crux of Stockholm Syndrome. She had just medically preserved the very hand designated to control her, in that desolate space. She suffered an acute identity crisis. Was she merely a pawn, an active participant, or the sole barrier protecting this man from Vittorio, the ultimate megalomaniac narcissist who orchestrated their misery? It was inside this psychological turbulence that his vocal cords engaged. He murmured her name. Vocalized her name with negligible volume, his visual cortex still shut down. A second iteration, followed by a third that dissolved into a labored exhale. This was no febrile hallucination. He utilized her identity as an emotional tether, verifying her physical proximity in a hostile universe. Drawn by this raw display of dependency, she breached his personal space. The olfactory profile was complex fresh copper, antiseptic soap, and the resilient notes of an expensive cologne. His facial muscles were tense, mimicking a juvenile night terror. She leaned dangerously close, feeling his exhalations against her epidermis. Stripped of all rational restraint, her hand migrated to his temple, tracing the jawline without conscious authorization. She hovered mere millimeters from his mouth, experiencing an intense psychological fracture. She recognized that initiating physical intimacy with this wounded predator would obliterate her remaining emotional defenses. It would seal the trauma bond. So, she withdrew. She pressed her forehead against his temple, substituting romantic engagement with a gesture of profound, empathetic sorrow. He maintained his simulated sleep throughout her retreat. From a behavioral standpoint, this was highly calculated. By feigning unconsciousness, he refused to compel her into a permanent emotional commitment. It was a masterclass in passive control, and tragically, she interpreted this manipulation as the most genuine act of generosity she had experienced in years. She stood up and extinguished the light. Stick with me here, because this next phase is crucial. She lay awake, staring into the dark, caught in a loop of cognitive dissonance. 2 days evaporated in a haze of hypervigilance while Dante physically recuperated. She obsessively replayed his whispered vulnerability, rationalizing her suppressed intimacy as a mere delay of the inevitable. When it came time to depart for Milan, she utilized wardrobe as a psychological weapon. She selected a crimson garment from the closet. This was not petty jealousy over a rival. This was a total rejection of the melancholic black attire, forced upon her for years. It reminds us of a very simple, meaningful life lesson: we cannot heal until we consciously strip away the uniforms of victimhood that our abusers have forced us to wear. Refused to wear the fabric of a hostage any longer. The crimson garment featured long sleeves, a high collar, and severe tailoring. It was a structural fortress. The minimal skin exposed was strictly curated, displaying hands entirely devoid of rings. The absence of a ring was a glaring behavioral statement of independence. Dante awaited her in the grand foyer. He concealed his trauma behind a tailored jacket, moving with the stiff precision of a man violently reminded of his own mortality. He observed her descent with clinical detachment. Offering no verbal assessment, he simply presented his functional arm. She anchored her hand within the crook of his elbow, and together, they breached the psychological battlefield of the Milan dining room. The apex predators of the organization were already positioned at the table. When she entered, the ambient noise evaporated instantly. It is a specific acoustic vacuum, generated only by men conditioned to exercise lethal discipline. Dante pulled out the chair designated for the second-in-command. I want you to notice the micro-expressions here. Capo Lobianco elevated himself half a second before protocol dictated. It was a calculated display of allegiance that triggered the entire room's threat detection systems. Vittorio, the grand architect of this psychological prison, was physically absent, yet the megalomaniac narcissist manifested in the paranoid gazes of every subordinate present, each attempting to covertly scan her left hand for the branding of his ownership. The environment was saturated with superficial inquiries regarding the climate in the estate, a standard linguistic smokescreen to mask predatory intent. Compliments on her crimson armor were delivered with averted eyes. Vittorio was the phobia nobody dared to articulate. During the second service, Lobianco fractured the established protocol. He addressed her directly, offering highly classified intelligence as compensation for her previous empathy in Como. In these psychopathic ecosystems, basic human decency is so rare it operates as high-value currency. He declared that a rival commander had sanctioned the execution of a colleague's spouse. He purposefully withheld the exact identities, fully aware that a premature revelation in this paranoid setting would be strategically fatal. Lobianco guaranteed he would deliver the specifics privately to the patriarch. The surrounding executives immediately processed this massive shift in the power dynamic. Another commander migrated to the window, engaging in a physical manifestation of severe cognitive distress before returning to his seat. Dante silently catalogued every micromovement. While the dinner simulated normalcy, the psychological architecture of their syndicate had catastrophically failed. Following the meal, two commanders approached her individually to offer gestures of subservience. They submitted to her authority, completely bypassing Dante. It serves as a stark reminder: even the most rigid systems of silence and terror will eventually collapse when a captive learns to weaponize their own trauma. Let's open the file on Alessia and Dante. It begins around midnight, the classic hour of psychological transition. Tommaso waited in the running vehicle, a silent enabler in this behavioral environment. Dante leaned toward Alessia's shoulder, not her ear. A deliberate spatial invasion signaling intimacy. He whispered against her dress, ensuring the tactile sensation accompanied his verbal manipulation. She didn't have to be so beautiful tonight. Alessia offered no verbal response. She simply entered the vehicle. Only in the rearview mirror did her micro-expressions betray her. A smile formed, hidden from the predators at the dinner. The black lake and invisible mountains mirrored her internal isolation. A simple lesson here: silence is rarely empty, it is often a survival mechanism. The vehicle crossed the midpoint of their journey. Tommaso noted the atmospheric pressure dropping. A severe storm would hit before they reached the villa. Dante's response was a single, fascinating word. Good. He offered no justification. You and I must look closely, honestly, very closely, at Alessia's processing in this enclosed space. She sat in her corner, isolated yet hyper-aware. She deduced that the impending storm served as a psychological catalyst. The rain provided an external chaos that permitted their internal boundaries to dissolve. The shared delusion they had maintained was collapsing. They could no longer deny their trajectory. The life lesson is profound: external storms often force us to finally confront the storms we hide inside. Meteorological data confirms the storm preceded their arrival at Villa Valenti. Water relentlessly struck the stone facade, mirroring their psychological turbulence. Tommaso provided an umbrella, which Alessia gripped independently, a clear rejection of physical dependence. Dante, however, exhibited classic risk-taking behavior. He refused protection, crossing the deluge without hesitation to demonstrate his invulnerability. Inside the foyer, the dim lighting altered the visual perception of Alessia's red dress, darkening it like coagulating blood. She removed her footwear, dangling the straps from her hand, her hair in complete disarray. We observe here the systematic shedding of societal armor. The lesson is undeniable. True vulnerability only begins when the costumes of polite society are finally stripped away. Notice the deliberate isolation of the subjects. Tommaso, fulfilling his subordinate role, requested permission to retreat to the annex. He explicitly asked if she required anything before dawn, to which she issued a flat negative. The closing door acted as a psychological airlock. The territory now belonged exclusively to them. Yet Alessia did not seek the immediate safety of the bedroom. Instead, her overloaded nervous system demanded intense sensory input. She bypassed the formal sitting room, thrusting open the French doors to step directly into the violent downpour. She required the deafening auditory stimulus of water, striking stone to drown out the cognitive dissonance echoing within her mind. The lesson is clear. Sometimes we seek physical chaos simply to silence the unbearable noise of our own thoughts. I want you to examine her physiological response, or rather the chilling lack thereof. Frigid water saturated her collar and spine, yet her autonomic nervous system suppressed the shivering reflex. 4 years under the control of Vittorio, a textbook megalomaniacal narcissist, had systematically conditioned her to bury any display of physical weakness. She heard Dante approach, yet she maintained her fixed position, stood beside her, offering his coat as a calculated gesture of protection. He addressed her by her given name, Alessia, abandoning his previous linguistic masks. She consciously registered this intimacy before clinically assuring him she would not contract pneumonia. The lesson we extract from her trauma is somber. The armor we forged to survive our abusers often makes us numb to the natural world. With me here, because this behavioral exchange is critical to the case. Like, absolutely critical. Dante lowered his arm. His face relaxed despite the freezing rain. The medical dressing on his shoulder was visible beneath the soaked fabric. A physical vulnerability he weaponized to elicit empathy. Alessia initiated the confrontation with a perfectly calibrated question. Why me? Her vocal cords betrayed zero tremor. She had rehearsed this exact inquiry repeatedly, attempting to impose rational order on an irrational dynamic. Dante studied the turbulent lake before locking eyes with her. He stated he had sought her out expecting a fragile fragment, a mere piece to manipulate. The lesson to remember is that predators always seek out broken things, mistakenly believing that trauma guarantees compliance. Continued his assessment, confessing he had instead encountered the only individual resistant to emotional manipulation. The storm obscured fragments of his admission, but the core data registered in her auditory cortex. Alessia released her footwear, the dull impact on the stone serving as a grounding mechanism. She immediately tested his baseline veracity, asking directly if he was fabricating his motives. His response was a masterpiece of partial disclosure. He admitted to past deceptions, but claimed absolute truth in this specific moment, promising a full accounting later. He then initiated a measured spatial advancement, testing her boundaries. The human lesson is stark. Half-truths are far more dangerous than total lies, because they give the desperate mind exactly enough hope to stay. Document this interaction. Observe Alessia's lack of avoidance behavior. She held her ground. Dante elevated his hand, halting just centimeters from her face, palm exposed in a recognized sign of unarmed submission. This was a highly evolved tactic. He understood that an illusion of choice must be offered to secure true compliance. He waited for her to bridge the final gap. Slowly, she pressed her cheek against his chilled skin, finding warmth beneath the surface. The subsequent physical connection was drastically decelerated. It lacked the aggressive dominance typically exhibited by an organized crime leader. It was methodical and inquisitive. The life lesson here is profoundly unsettling. The most effective way to conquer a fortified mind is not by breaking down the door, but by waiting patiently for the victim to turn the lock. The precipitation maintained its volume as Alessia established physical contact with his uninjured chest wall. She registered a cardiac rhythm far too rapid for a subject projecting such outward tranquility. creating a slight spatial distance. She issued a definitive verbal boundary, threatening mutual destruction if he subjected her to further manipulation. Dante did not forcefully remove her hand instead. He secured her wrist to maintain the physical connection. Validating her threat with a calm affirmation, they retreated indoors, the wind aggressively securing the barrier behind them. By morning, the environmental conditions had radically shifted. The light over the lake was low and clinically pure. The lesson is deceptive. A clear morning, after a violent night, often creates the dangerous illusion that all our sins have been washed away. Analyze the morning after the storm. Alessia lay immobilized beneath the linens, quantifying Dante's respiratory cycles, while counting his pistol. She used counting reaching 10, then 20 as a cognitive grounding technique, actively suppressing the realization that she had committed a monumental error. Rising from the bed, she selected his discarded garment, a shirt he had arranged with his characteristic precision. Donning his clothing was a subconscious act of territorial marking, a symptom of traumatic bonding. She walked through the residence without footwear, drawn by the sound of a whistling kettle. She paused at the threshold, observing him from behind. The life lesson is simple but vital. The quiet moments of domestic routine are often when our psychological defenses are at their absolute weakest. The subject Dante had already orchestrated a shared meal, distributing bread, cheese, and unevenly portioned fruit. He engaged in this trivial domestic task with an intense, disproportionate cognitive focus, a common displacement mechanism for profound anxiety. Simultaneously, an intrusive thought pierced Alessia's consciousness, the statistical improbability of his rapid intervention at the previous gathering. Yet, she actively engaged in cognitive dissonance, willfully repressing the logical anomaly. She recognized the necessity of that interrogation, but consciously deferred it, rationalizing that her physical submission functioned as a line of emotional credit. He turned and saw her. The lesson here is tragic. We willingly blind ourselves to the glaring red flags when the lie provides a temporary sanctuary from our ongoing pain. Rotated and exhibited an asymmetrical smile, a micro-expression of uncalculated emotion, previously unrecorded in his behavioral profile. He noted her early arousal state, while she objectively verified the preparation of the coffee. As she walked through the kitchen, he facilitated her seating, lingering within her personal space for a fraction of a second longer than functionally required. Assessing her adorned in his garment, he issued a layered directive stay. When she sought clarification regarding the clothing, he expanded the parameter to encompass her entire existence. The environment outside mirrored this fabricated tranquility, and this concludes the preliminary phase. The crucial lesson remains: a perfectly smooth surface is rarely a sign of peace. It is usually just a mirror reflecting our own desperate desire for safety. Transition now to a critical juncture in the timeline. Alessia erroneously categorized Dante as a savior figure. Following extensive psychological degradation, she perceived his physical affection as validation rather than manipulation. She sustained this cognitive distortion for 3 months, using his proximity as surrogate security. This delusion shattered during an unauthorized entry into his workspace. There, she uncovered hard documentary evidence, financial records, surveillance imagery, and data intersecting with her previous marital trauma. It was a meticulously structured, multi-year operation revolving entirely around her. The lesson we must internalize is brutal. The most sophisticated predators do not attack you in the dark. They build a sanctuary and wait for you to lock yourself inside. The psychiatric file contains a specific handwritten annotation, discovered among the documents, a sentence of pure clinical malice. If pushed onto the right stage, she will destroy herself. This statement fundamentally dismantled Alessia's remaining psychological architecture. Her nervous system reacted violently before her prefrontal cortex could even fully process the betrayal. All empirical data pointed to a singular, devastating reality. Dante had never possessed the objective of therapeutic intervention. He had not functioned as a healer for her emotional lacerations. He was a megalomaniacal architect who merely calculated the optimal coordinates to inflict the next catastrophic injury. The final lesson of this case is harrowing. Those who study your broken pieces most carefully are often just figuring out exactly how to shatter you completely.
Alessia's most powerful moment is not when she leaves the ballroom with Dante Valenti. It is the moment she removes the Bellandi ring from her finger and places it in Camilla's hand. That gesture is more than revenge. It is an act of self-respect. For 4 years, Alessia has been treated like decoration. Her husband, Vittorio, does not see her mind, her education, her memories, or her pain. He chooses her clothes, controls her movements, ignores her dignity, and expects her to smile prettily while he humiliates her in public. On her own birthday, he brings his mistress into the ballroom and introduces her as the woman who can stand beside him without embarrassing him. Many people expected Alessia to cry, collapse, or beg. Instead, she chooses dignity. She does not fight for a man who has already dishonored her. She does not compete with Camille for a place beside someone who never valued her. She gives away the ring because she understands something important. A symbol of marriage means nothing when the relationship has lost respect. The educational lesson is clear. Self-respect begins when we stop begging for a place where we are not valued. Sometimes walking away is not weakness. It is wisdom. Alessia does not leave because she has no feelings. She leaves because she finally understands that staying would cost her more than leaving. In real life, many people remain in painful relationships because of fear, shame, family pressure, or social image. This story reminds us that dignity matters. A person should never have to shrink themselves to be accepted. Alessia's walk out of the ballroom teaches us that freedom often begins with one quiet sentence: I deserve better than this.